Hello everyone, my name is Derek, and today I'm going to present our work on normal-driven spherical shape analogies. And this is work presented at SGP 2021, and this is also a joint work with Alec Jacobson. In this paper, we propose a method for transferring geometric styles, and we formulate this problem as a shape analogy problem. So basically, given a reference shape A and a style shape A', and an input shape B, the goal of shape analogies is to create an output shape B' whose relationship with the input shape B equals to the relationship between A' and A. In this work, we also make a specific assumption that our reference shape A is always a sphere. And we will talk about why we made this assumption later, but this is the reason why we call our method spherical shape analogies. And also because of this reason, we typically ignore plotting the sphere multiple times. So for example, in this following talk, you're going to see a lot of figures like this, where we only visualize the input and the style shapes and the output. Before talking about our algorithm, an important question we need to ask first is, how can we define the style of a 3D shape? And this is a very difficult question to answer because if you ask different people in different contexts, you will typically get different answers. But the one I like in particular is the one presented by Eric Fernet in 1995. He defines a style as a distinctive manner which permits the grouping of words into related categories. My interpretation is that if you can find a method that can classify a bunch of, for example, shapes into two different categories, then the method you use to classifying those shapes will be a definition of geometric style. So let me give a simple example. If I hand you a bunch of images, how are you going to classify these images into two different categories, for example? And intuitively, you may want to classify these images into these two categories. What you use to classify those images are based on the colors of those images. Basically, the image on the left shares similar color content, and those colors that you use for defining the style is called elements of the style. And in geometries, the elements of geometric styles has also been studied. And for example, the one presented by Nutt in 1928 proposed to use the shapes to define the geometric style. And the shape I mean here, it means the shape of the individual part of the entire geometry. For example, these two architectures share the similar style because they have similar shapes on those components. And another element of style is the proportion, which is easy to understand. And the third component is the lines or the characteristic curves within the shapes. And basically, these three elements of style are used extensively in a lot of research papers. They are used these methods to build classifiers for shapes with or without similar geometric styles. And for example, given this query shape on the left and two shapes shown on the right, these elements of geometric styles are very useful to build a classifier to say, okay, these two shapes share a similar style, and these two shapes do not share a similar style. However, although those geometric style elements are very suitable for building descriptive models, they are not suitable for building generative models. For example, if I want to turn this cow into the style of this cone, the previous method cannot achieve the effect like the video showed here. So basically it means that we have to introduce a new way of defining geometric styles so that we can build generative models on top of that. The one we choose is to use surface normals. So basically, instead of looking at the appearance of these shapes, we look at the surface normals of these shapes. And we say that if the output geometry share the similar normal characteristics as the style shape shown on the top right, then we say that these two shapes share a similar style. And surface normals are a very important and fundamental geometric quantities that is used in everywhere in geometry processing. For example, in geometric filtering, or in parameterization, or in fabrication, or in architecture. And besides these applications, surface normal has also been used for stylizing geometry before. And in particular, this cubic stylization, that basically defines one norm on normals to turn the shape into the style of a cube. And in our work, we can actually perceive cubic stylization as a spherical shape analogy problem, but we use cube as our style shape. And an interesting thing is that in this year SGP, There's also a paper called Gauss Stylization, which solves a very similar problem to ours. Basically, they define some preferred normal functions visualized on the top left corner of each figure, and they will deform the input shape towards preferred normals. So now let's jump into our algorithm. So basically, given the shape analogy formulation, our first step is to compute correspondences between the style shape and the sphere. And our second step is to compute the correspondences between the sphere and the input shape so that we can kind of transfer the surface normals from the style shape to the input shape in order to create another input shape but with a target normals on the surface, like the color shown here. And the final step is to take this target normal and this input geometry, and we solve an optimization problem in order to get a deformed model whose actual normals are the same or approximately the same as the prescribed target normals. So in order to do the first two steps, let's talk about shape matching. So general shape matching is a very, very difficult problem. Basically, given any pairs of two shapes, if you want to find correspondences between them, this is actually a very difficult problem because you need to figure out what are the semantically corresponding parts. And there's also some problematic regions like the horn of this cow. And basically, if you have a point on the horn of this cow, there's no corresponding point lies on this human. So exactly for this reason, we simplify our problem and assume that our reference shape is always a sphere. And basically what we need to solve is how we're going to map a shape to a sphere. And this is a much simpler problem, and we can have different ways of doing that. For example, one way is to use the Gauss map. Basically, given a point on the shape, we can compute its unit surface normal, and that surface normal corresponds to a single point on a unit sphere. Then we can use this point to determine how we're going to transfer signals from the sphere to this shape. And basically, we can do this for all the points on the mesh, and we'll be able to transfer this color dependent sphere into a cow look like that. And the other ways of doing that for genus zero shape is to use curvature flow to actually deform this cow into a sphere. And for example, using the method called the mean curvature flow proposed by Castine and colleagues in 2012. And because this deformation maintains the connectivity, so we end up getting a one-to-one correspondences between the input and the sphere. So again, if we have some function on the sphere, we can transfer that to this cow, follow this one-to-one mapping. Basically, you can try to argue that which one's better, which is not, based on, for example, the properties of those maps. But actually, in terms of like stylization, it all depends on your preference. There's no true answer saying that, okay, Gauss map is better than curvature flow, or curvature flow is better than the Gauss map. So basically, in our first step, if the style shape is a convex and low poly shapes, using Gauss map typically is good enough and give us a very good transfer from the convex shape to a sphere, like the color highlighted here. But if our style shape is a non-convex and high poly shapes, like this alloy, and we found that the curvature flow will be a better approach to compute the mapping from this shape to a sphere. And for our second step, which computes the correspondences between the input and the reference, we can also utilize these two methods. And if we use these two methods to compute correspondences and optimize the results, these are two types of different results we can obtain using either Gauss map or the curvature flow. And in particular, if you look at the example in curvature flow, this is quite interesting. Basically, this curvature flow gives you a one-to-one mapping from the input to a sphere. So if you use this to stylize your geometry, you actually try to treat the entire geometry as a whole, and you want to deform that into literally the appearance of that style shape, like this cone here. But if you use Gauss map, it is not one-to-one mapping, so you may turn each part of your shape into the style of a cone, and there's no answer that which one's right, which one's wrong. But in this paper, we prefer the result shown on the top, so we use this Gauss map as a way for computing our second step. So what we have discussed so far allows us to compute the mapping from the sphere to the style and from the sphere to the input. So that allows us to generate target normals on the input shape. So and the next step is to talk about how are I going to actually deform this input shape so that the actual normals are approximately the same as our target normals. So to achieve this deformation, we formulate it as a normal-driven optimization problem, which we can typically write down an objective like this, where the first term is a regularization term, which wants the output shape to look similar to the input shape. And the second term is our energy defined on the output normals. And in our case of having a target normal, this could be the distance between the output normal and our target normal. In this energy, we use V to represent input vertex positions, and we use V tilde to represent output vertex locations. And our N here is the unit normal of the output mesh V tilde. And we also have a parameter lambda, which controls the balance between these two terms. But typically, when you encounter an optimization problem in this format, this is very difficult to optimize, and due to this normals of the output mesh. And the reason is because this normal of the output mesh is a nonlinear function in terms of the output vertex locations. So typically, you'll need to involve some approximations or some advanced optimization scheme in order to minimize this energy. So what we'll do is to do a change of variable. So if you look at this NV tilde, this is our output normal, but this is nothing but a unit vector. And if you zoom into the unit vector, what I can do is that a unit vector can only do rotation. It cannot do scaling or shearing, because once you do, for example, scaling, you will no longer live in the space of unit vector. So based on this observation, we can actually represent our output normal as a rotation times another unit vector, n hat. And we can do this substitution on our energy formulation into this one, where the R is just a 3x3 rotation matrix, and our n hat is, we choose it to be the input surface normals for our convenience, because this is constant throughout optimization. And the key benefits of doing this change of variable is that once you do this, you will no longer need very advanced optimization method for handling those nonlinear output normals. You can do a very efficient local global update strategy, which the local step consists of many small SVDs, and the global step is nothing but a single linear solve. In order to talk more specifically about how we're going to turn those energy into a local global optimization format, let's go through an explicit example. In this example, we have a simple energy, where the first term is our regularization, and the second term is our normal-based energy. And for the first regularization, in this example, we choose it to be the as rigid as possible regularization, which defines on each vertex, and for each vertex, we extract its one-ring neighbors. And among the one-ring neighbors, we also extract a bunch of edge vectors from the center vertex to the neighboring vertices. And this RK is the rotation to rotate those edge vectors, and those V tilde represent the same set of vectors on the output mesh. And this as rigid as possible basically measures the difference between the rotated patch and the output patch, and weighted by some cotangent weights. So intuitively, it basically measures the local rigidity between the input and the output. And for the second part, this NK is the output's vertex normal, and this TK is the target normal. And the second term basically measures the distance between the output normal and the target normal weighted by the vertex area AK. And again, because this energy is nonlinear, so we can apply our change of variables to replace this output normal with the rotation times the input normal, so we end up getting this as our final formula. Then this energy is ready for defining a local global update strategy. For the local step, we fix all the output vertices. We just want to compute the optimal rotation RK. And this basically boils down to solving a single SVD for each vertex. And we can solve it in parallel, which is very fast. And for the global step, we can fix the rotations R, and the goal is to compute the deformed vertex V tilde. And if you reorganize those terms, this will both still down to solving a single linear system. And you can then iterate between this local step and the global step to minimize your energy. So far, we have talked about essential components in order to do our spherical shape analogies. And for the first step and the second step is to compute the correspondences, and we can use either the Gauss map or the curvature flow to determine how you want to map signals from the shape to the other. And once we figure out the first two steps, we will be able to obtain an input shape with target normal based on its vertices or faces. And then the next step is to run the normal-driven optimization we discussed above to actually deform the model so that actual output normals is the same as the target normal. And we can achieve that by doing three simple steps. First is to compute the target normals and then perform the local and global steps. After that, you have everything you need in order to do spherical shape analogies. So on the gray shape is the input, and the green shape is the style shape, and the blue shapes are our output shapes. And because we have the curvature flow method to compute the correspondences between the style shape and the sphere, so we can also use it to do stylization for style shapes that are non-convex or smooth. And also we can control the stylization by changing a lambda, which is a constant that controls the balance between the regularization and normal base energy. If we choose to have a bigger lambda, if we put more weights on this normal energy, so we get more stylized result. And another interesting thing is that we can mimic the material capture and do it on geometry. So basically material capture, or called the MatCap, is a rendering technique where your input is an image shown on the left. It contains like a hemisphere, and you can draw whatever lighting or texture you want on this hemisphere, and you'll be able to transfer the hemisphere to your rendering to render a 3D shape shown on the right. And we can also do the same thing for geometry, because what we need is nothing but some normal-based function on the sphere, so we can actually have some manually painted normals on the sphere, and we can use that to realize those styles defined by those sphere onto a 3D shape. Those are not the end of the story. We can actually further extend our method to more general cases. For example, what we have discussed only includes the regularization using as rigid as possible energy, but actually there are a lot more regularizations that we can use. For example, we can use the one that do not want to stretch the material, but you are allowed to freely bend your material, and where you can also use other regularization that try to preserve the angles to create as conform as possible regularization. And for example, if we take this square mesh as the input and we try to drag the middle part and squeeze the boundary part, and if we want to optimize that design constraint according to these three regularizations, we'll get three different results. So on the left, we're using the as rigid as possible, basically gives you like a smooth deformation everywhere. In the middle part, because we penalize the stretching but no bending, so this regularization allows the triangle to freely bend to create sharp corners, and this will increase the energy value, so they are happily create a lot of sharp creases like the ones shown in the middle. And on the right is the one that preserves angles, but because it does not penalize scaling effect, so it is happy to kind of squeeze the shape or scale up the shape in order to create a smooth deformation, but preserves angles. And with these regularization, for example, if we replace our ARAC regularization with a stretch-only regularization and use our cubes as the style shape, we can actually realize a bunch of PolyCube maps, which is a technique for parameterization or for quad meshing. And actually, we can further generalize that. If we do not use the cube as our style shapes, we can actually generalize PolyCube maps to turn it into other polygonal boxes instead of cubes. And another example is that if we use the conformal regularization, which allows us to kind of scale down or scale up local geometry, this could be useful for adding some details to the geometry. For example, on the left, we take a low resolution mesh and existing normal map. We can actually upsample the mesh and then use our normal-driven optimization to actually recover those textures on the geometry for fabrication purposes. And on the right-hand side, you're seeing a similar example where we have some 2D texture image of the normals. We can synthesize those textures onto a 3D shape and then generate geometric textures on the shape. And another more exciting extension is that we can actually work with other normal-based energies. So in this part, this is our original formulation. And if you zoom into the part that's shown on the right, and typically this target normal is generated by the spherical shape analogies. But actually, this T can be a minimizer of some other normal-based energy. So let me give you an example. Here is a technique proposed by Stein and colleagues to characterize whether a surface is discrete developable. And typically, if you look at some one ring patch of a vertex, And those surface normals are pointed towards different directions. So if you look at its the image on the Gauss map, you will see the area is not zero. And this means that this local patch is not developable. But if your surface normals are actually lies on the same plane or lies on two planes, and its corresponding area on the Gauss map is actually zero because it is either represents a dot or it represents as a line. So in these two cases, those meshes are developable. And basically in this paper, they proposed a developable flow algorithm that can turn an input shape into a developable surface. And we can actually utilize their energy to generate a target normals that are developable and use our normal-driven optimization to optimize for that. So here you can see the results. On the left-hand side, you're seeing the input mesh. And if you look at the Gaussian curvature of the input mesh, you can see a lot of like dark blue and dark red color. This basically represents that the Gaussian curvature is not zero. So this surface is not developable. But if you optimize this mesh using our approach, we can generate a developable output surface. And if you look at the Gaussian curvature, it is almost zero everywhere, except some Gaussian curvature concentrate on some creases on the shape. And if you use our method, you can actually be more robust because right now we have our regularizations to regularize the developable flow algorithm so that you can directly apply to all these shapes without any remeshing. So in conclusion, in this work, we propose a very simple and fast algorithm for doing like style transfer. And it's also very general. As you can see in the developable surface approximation, it's also applicable to other normal-based energies. But there are still some questions. For example, if I randomly give you some target normals, are those normals actually realizable by deformation? Would it encourage the surface to go inside out or something else? And currently our method can support the input shape and the output shape to be hygienous like this spiral lamp, but we cannot support the style shape which is hygienous, for example, like this. And the reason is because for example, if you want to use curvature flow to flow that to a sphere, you cannot do that. It requires some topological changes. And it will be interesting to see whether we can also do some stylization that requires a change of topology. And another limitation is that currently our method does not care about like area distortion. Either if you use curvature flow or use Gauss map, you will have severe area distortion. And that will be problematic if you want to transfer some high frequency curvatures like the ones shown on this egg. And so after that, I would like to thank all the funding agencies and also thank you all for listening.